if you wanted to assassinate Putin, you wouldn't launch drones off and hope that they would somehow know where he was in the Kremlin unless he was sunbathing on the roof.
Russia has accused Ukraine of an assassination attempt on President Vladimir Putin. Footage, which is circulated on Russian social media, shows two drones flying over the Kremlin before exploding. The Russian authorities confirmed Putin was not in the Kremlin, and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said his country was not behind it. So let's get the latest on this and talk to Iuliia Mendel, journalist, former press secretary to President Zelensky, speaking from Kyiv. Welcome to you, Iuliia.
John, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming, Iuliia. So first of all, what are the Kremlin saying about this?
Let me say that the first everyday call of Putin's press secretary Peskov with journalists that allegedly happened after this attack did not mention anything about the drone attack. And in 2 hours after that, we saw a lot of messaging where Kremlin tries to say that Ukraine sent drones to attack Kremlin, and that actually that was the attack on President Putin himself. And now they can mirror the actions. They threat to attack Ukraine decision centers, as they say, which means they threat to attack Kyiv. In fact, I live in Kyiv, and immediately in an hour after this news, we've got sirens sounding here twice and in different regions of Ukraine.
Right. And in Kyiv, the response has been simply to dismiss the whole thing out of hand as not plausible, not credible.
President Zelensky himself, his press secretary, and the advisor to his staff of chief, they all said that Ukraine didn't have anything in common with these drones attacks. But I want you to think about the reality. Ukrainian drones to attack the Kremlin, they needed to travel around 1,000 kilometers, and they needed not to be noticed by the military that is accumulated near the borders of Ukraine, by any kind of intelligence, so legendary famous FSB, FSO, etc., etc. Second, let me mention that the Kremlin is actually one of the most secure places in the world. Yeah. And it's very difficult to understand why the air defense did not shut down any drones, and how it happened that it can they got to Kremlin and then they caused the fire, they attacked the Kremlin, and why it was not mentioned by Putin's press secretary immediately after the attack.
Yes, and I guess the calculation or the concern now, Iuliia, is that the Russian side will use this as a pretext for upping the viciousness of their attacks in Ukraine.
John, I think there are two reasons why Russia could have done this. First, because the morale among Russians because of war is very low. So they could psychologically mobilize Russians, trying to justify the possible attacks, trying to make them angry at Ukraine. And the second, of course, they already threaten us a lot, and we expect that there could be another attack. The advisor to Zelensky's chief of staff, Mikhailo Podolyak, already said that Russia is planning some massive terrorist attack.
Iuliia Mendel, great to talk to you. Thank you. Now, let's get the thoughts of retired Air Marshal, RAF Air Marshal Ed Stringer now. He served as Assistant Chief of Defence Staff for Operations in the Ministry of Defence. Ed, welcome.
Good evening, John.
Hi. It'd be good to get your expert thoughts on this. I mean, as a complete layman, the idea of a drone assassination attempt on President Putin seems implausible, to put it mildly, given how well defended the Kremlin must be, and he within it, and just the sheer logistical difficulty of doing anything of the kind.
Yeah, it's clearly not an assassination attempt. As he said, you wouldn't launch drones from. It was interesting. Your previous correspondent talked about thousands of kilometres, about 500. It's technically feasible, but that's not how. If you wanted to assassinate Putin, you wouldn't launch drones off and hope that they would somehow know where he was in the Kremlin unless he was sunbathing on the roof. And it's well known that Putin doesn't spend a lot of time in the Kremlin at the moment anyway, so it's certainly not an attempt at an assassination, and no one would take that accusation seriously.
No, and Iuliia's thought there that it could just be a diversionary tactic intended to, stir up the sentiment of the Russian people, that has a distinctly plausible ring.
It does. There are many arguments, and there are no easy answers. Putin has conducted false flag operations in the past, false flag operations that have killed Russians. I mean, this is an incredibly ruthless regime. However, by attacking the Kremlin and causing fires on the roof of the Kremlin, it's also quite embarrassing. They would have to admit here that their own air defences allowed, if they are going to paint it as being a Ukrainian activity, as has just been described, they would have to admit that the Ukrainians can build drones now that can fly all the way to the Kremlin and get through undetected by the vaunted Russian military and the Russian air defences. So it's still very embarrassing if it's a Russian false flag.
Indeed, I mean, though the case for a diversionary tactic is also a strong one, given the state of the Russian war effort, the Russian campaign, which is I don't know, faltering, to put it mildly. And when we're hearing Ed, about Russian parades being cancelled in various parts of Russia and in Russia-occupied Crimea.
Yes, because it's not a good time, is it, to advertise great Russian military successes? And indeed, the history of Russia is that recent history of Russia is that outside of Moscow, then there have been regular demonstrations in the regions, and the Russian subjects there are a lot less loyal than Putin would want them to be. So clearly, he would feel that those May Day parades are could be a provocation that he couldn't control. So yes, you're right. And if I was Zelensky and I was looking to condone this, and if it was a Ukrainian action, I'd be thinking, well, would I want to do this? Because it's not going to achieve anything militarily. As we've just said, it isn't going to be an assassination attempt on the Kremlin. It does demonstrate the weakness of the Russians. It does demonstrate that we can tweak the nose of Goliath, as it were. But he must worry that the counter to that is it could be a rallying call for Russians who at the moment are a bit ambivalent about the war, but don't like to see their centre of power, the Kremlin itself, being attacked, and Putin could use it therefore to rally the troops. Yeah. So finally balanced arguments either way as to who has the most to gain or lose from this.
And meanwhile, Ed, we wait for the coming offensives and counteroffensives.
Indeed, we do. I mean, the first thing to say is that much vaunted Russian mobilization, which, if you remember back to September last year, was their reply to losing all that territory up around Kharkiv and then Kherson. Well, those 300,000 troops don't appear to have done too much since they were deployed just after Christmas, January. And I think we identified really the creeping start of the Russian offensive was early February. We're about 80 days on from that. And as the Pentagon announced the other day about all the Russians have managed to do is lose 100,000 casualties. I reckon that's probably a low estimate. And of that, 20,000 dead. And once again, that would seem a low estimate as well. You'd normally take one in three. So huge losses for the gain of token amounts of ground around Bakhmut. So it does look like the Russian offensive has just fizzled out. And for the sake of the Ukrainians, one hopes that the brigades that we've been training for them, their other partner nations have been training for them, supporting nations, and they now have, one is hearing tales of between 12 and 18 brigades formed. Zelensky knows that there won't be another wave, and therefore I don't think we should expect him to rush into this. The Ukrainians will be sensible, and they'll only launch this operation when they're sure that they have maximised the chances of success.
Well, I'm John Pienaar, and if you found that interesting, we are here each day, Monday to Thursday, 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock on Drive, and from 7 till 8, Pienaar and Friends, where we discuss the big stories of the day each day on Times Radio.